Marokopa, night air, wet gravel. Two headlamps carving a tunnel through the dark. A quad bike coughs past paddocks and electric fences. And then the road spikes sing. The first officer steps out and the bush erupts. 4 years of whispers and sightings. A nation hunting a father who vanished into the green. The bunker life, the stolen moments, the rifle, the kids.
A man in New Zealand who absconded with his 3 children nearly 4 years ago has been killed in a shootout with officers.
No doubt Tom Phillips wanted to kill.
This is what wanted man Tom Phillips and his children had recently been calling home.
He is no hero.
Police say they fired back when the man, Tom Phillips, shot an officer.
By sunrise, 1 man is dead. 3 children are found and an entire country is asking, how did this go on for so long? And who did we become while it did? Tonight, Tom Phillips, the disappearances, the camp, the rumours we can't repeat, and the facts that we can. This is Shadow Matter. G'day, kia ora and Xin Chao. Welcome back to Shadow Matter, where I take a look at a darker side of our world with a focus on stories and cases from Australia and New Zealand here every second Sunday. A big shout out to all my new channel members who have decided to go beyond the shadows. You bloody legends. The recent Tom Phillips case in New Zealand is one that inevitably lends itself to becoming a part of Kiwi folklore. The tragedy, the myth, the man, and the suspicious injunction that has everyone seeking more information. The kind of tragedy that will undoubtedly become a part of late night over beer or coffee discussions that could end up dividing the nation, or even your own household. Is Tom Phillips a monster or a desperate father who caught a bad break? Well, put your kids to bed, dim the lights and shut the curtains so the neighbours don't think you're home, and set your notifications to silent. It's about to get dark in here. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper. A whisper carried on the damp, salt air of the rugged Waikato coast, through the twisted pines of Marokopa, a place where isolation is both a blessing and a curse. In September 2021, Tom Phillips was just another local name, a farmer, a father of 3, someone you might nod to at the petrol station or pass on the narrow roads that thread between the cliffs and the Tasman Sea. He wasn't the kind of man who drew much attention. Quiet, competent in the bush, part of the landscape, more than part of the noise. But when he and his children first disappeared, the entire country would learn his name. The first disappearance. On the 11th of September 2021, the alarm was raised. Tom, then 34 years old, had vanished along with his 3 young children, Jada, Ember, and Maverick. Their ages ranged from just a toddler to primary schoolers, too young to walk off on their own, too vulnerable to be without care. The family ute, a Toyota Hilux, was later discovered at a beach just south of Marokopa. The discovery was ominous. The tide washed at its wheels, abandoned as if the driver had simply walked into the ocean. To many, it looked like a tragedy, a father and his children swept away, claimed by the notorious rips and currents of New Zealand's wild west coast. Police feared the worst. Locals joined search parties combing the rugged coastline and bush. The community held its breath, but days turned to weeks and no bodies surfaced, no footprints pointed to safety, no sightings reassured the worried nation. It was as though the bush had swallowed them whole. Then, on the 30th of September, nearly 3 weeks later, the whisper broke into a gasp. The Phillips family was found alive. The relief was palpable. Media headlines framed it as a miracle. Tom had simply walked back into town with the children in tow. The search had been frantic, the assumptions grim, and now here they were, hungry, tired, but alive. But alongside relief came questions. Where had they been? Why had Tom taken his kids into the wilderness, cut off from the family, from school, from the world? Reports at the time suggested they had been camping in dense bushland near Marokopa. Tom himself was tight-lipped.
Now, after about 20 or 19 days, Tom Phillips, along with his 3 children, came back to home and with no real explanation as to why he was away, except for that he was out camping. And there is some ideas floating around that this could have been about custody disputes.
He offered no real explanation, no apology, and no detail that satisfied the gnawing curiosity of police or public. For many, it was just one of those rural mysteries, the kind you chalk up to personal reasons, shrug, and move on. But it wasn't the last time Tom Phillips would vanish. December 2021. The second disappearance. Just over 2 months later, on the 12th of December 2021, Tom Phillips vanished again. This time, there was no ambiguity, no illusion of accident or tragedy. It was deliberate. He took his 3 children once more, slipping from sight and refusing to return. By this point, authorities were less forgiving. This was no accident. This was an abduction, a man withholding his children from their rightful lives, hiding them away from family and from the system designed to keep them safe.
Why has he done this, Rosie?
I would like to go into details about the background of a few things, but at the moment, the matter's before the courts. That's not possible. I would like New Zealand to know that when he left in December 2021 with his 3 children, he did have legal day-to-day care of those 3 children.
And it's also publicly on the record with New Zealand Police that custody now sits with oranga tamariki. Is that something that will be motivating Tom to stay in the bush?
I would imagine so, yes.
A warrant for his arrest was issued, but he was gone. The following months bled into years. Phillips became a ghost, whispered about, but rarely seen. Tips flowed in, a sighting here, a rumour there. Police trudged through the rugged King Country terrain, interviewed locals and appealed for information, but nothing concrete stuck. What made it so hard was the geography itself. The land around Marokopa is some of the wildest in New Zealand. Steep forested valleys, rivers that twist into dark gorges, and endless expanses of bush where a man who knows the land can disappear indefinitely. For someone like Phillips, experienced in hunting, bushcraft, and off-grid survival, it became clear he wasn't just lost, he was hiding. The longer Phillips remained missing, the more the story began to split the community. Some saw him as a selfish father, endangering his children, dragging them into a life of hardship and instability. Others, fewer but vocal, painted him as a rugged individualist, a man resisting state intrusion, raising his kids in the wild way from what he saw as a broken system. The truth was hidden under the canopy of Marokopa's bush, unreachable except to those inside it. Through 2022, sightings remained scarce. Rumours swirled, a man on a quad bike deep in the bush, supplies stolen from remote sheds, whispers of enablers helping him to survive. Police increased their appeals, but without hard evidence, the case grew cold in the public's mind. Still, the Phillips name lingered. His children's faces, plastered on missing posters, stared out from shop windows and police appeals. Their ages ticked up with every birthday spent unseen, somewhere out in the wilderness. What began as a story of relief, a father and kids miraculously found safe after their first disappearance, hardened into something darker after the second. Now it was a case of defiance, of a man deliberately rejecting the world outside his bush hideaway, forcing his children into isolation. By the end of 2022, Tom Phillips was no longer just another father from Marokopa. He had become something else, a fugitive, a mystery, a shadow figure, haunting the national imagination. The vanishings had set the stage. The years to come would transform this quiet family mystery into one of New Zealand's most bizarre and divisive manhunts. By 2023, the Phillips case had shifted from a mystery into something more unsettling. What had once been seen as a desperate family drama was morphing into an ongoing manhunt. Tom Phillips was no longer a missing person. He was a wanted man. On a chilly August morning, a grainy photograph ignited the media cycle. Captured on CCTV at a Bunnings warehouse in Te Rapa, Hamilton, the image showed a tall man in a mask browsing the aisles. To most shoppers, it was an ordinary scene in pandemic times. But police believed they knew the face beneath that mask: Tom Phillips. What made this sighting compelling wasn't just that it suggested Phillips had surfaced after nearly 2 years in hiding. It was that he appeared calm, calculated. He hadn't been dragged into view. He'd walked right into a busy hardware store with 2 of his children by his side. Witnesses recalled seeing a man with kids in tow buying supplies. The photograph hit news sites, social media, and television bulletins like wildfire. For families who had feared the children were lost, it was proof of life. They were alive, older now, and clearly still in their father's custody. Relief was tempered by frustration. How had he slipped in and out so easily? And why had no one stopped him? Just weeks later, things escalated further. In September 2023, Phillips was charged in connection with an armed robbery at a bank in Te Kuiti. The allegation shocked the country. What had begun as a custody case was now crossing into outright criminality. Police alleged that Phillips, disguised and armed, had stormed the bank, making off with thousands in cash. The charges were laid in his absence. A man already on the run was now accused of violent offending. For investigators, this was a tipping point. Phillips was no longer just a missing father who had taken his kids into hiding. He was a fugitive, prepared to take risks, to fund his life off-grid by whatever means necessary. These incidents, the Bunnings sighting and the robbery, revealed something about how Phillips was surviving. He wasn't living in complete isolation, untouched by civilization. He was dipping in and out, surfacing long enough to gather supplies or seize resources, then vanishing back into the bush. It was a pattern reminiscent of old outlaw folklore, the figure who materializes just long enough to be glimpsed before retreating into the wild. For law enforcement, it was maddening. For the public, it fed the myth. By late 2023, more reports filtered in. Locals claimed to have seen a man and children riding quad bikes across farmland and forestry tracks, often at night. These sightings were never formally confirmed, but they added weight to the idea that Phillips and his children were being sustained by more than just luck. He seemed to have resources: fuel, food, shelter, even vehicles. Was he stealing them? Were sympathizers helping him? Police openly stated their belief that Phillips had enablers, people either out of loyalty, fear, or misguided support who were helping him maintain his fugitive life. For ordinary New Zealanders, the story was surreal. This wasn't the United States with its vast deserts or Russia with endless tundra. This was New Zealand, a small modern nation where most missing person cases resolve quickly and fugitives rarely last more than a few days. Yet, here was a father living with 3 children, dodging authorities for years. Every new sighting sparked a flurry of news reports and public speculation. Was Tom Phillips hiding in caves, in abandoned huts, or in makeshift bush camps? Was he armed? Were the children safe, or were they enduring a harsh, unstable existence? The answers were elusive, but the questions grew louder with every month that passed. For police, the case was becoming a thorn in the side. Resources were stretched, the terrain unforgiving, and Phillips seemed to know every back road, every ridge, every track. Officers appealed for information, but leads went cold as quickly as they appeared. Behind the scenes, frustration simmered. Each public sighting reignited pressure on law enforcement, but none ended in capture. The longer Phillips evaded them, the more emboldened he seemed. As 2023 closed, the Phillips case had transformed in the eyes of the public. No longer was it framed as a custody dispute or even a survival story. It had become something larger, a test of the state's ability to enforce its laws, a manhunt that felt more like a drawn-out standoff. The children's faces grew older on the missing posters, but still, no one knew what daily life looked like for them, hidden away in the King Country bush. And Tom Phillips, once an ordinary father from Marokopa, was on his way to becoming one of New Zealand's most infamous fugitives. By 2024, the Tom Phillips case had grown into something more than a police file. It was a national fixation, a slow-burning saga that lived in headlines, whispered in pubs, and simmered in online forums. 2 years had passed since the second disappearance. The children were growing up in the shadows, and the manhunt, though unrelenting, had produced nothing but fleeting glimpses. Then, in October, the silence broke. It was a grainy video captured on private farmland near Marokopa. In the frame, a man, unmistakably Phillips, carrying a rifle slung across his back. With him, 3 children, each hauling heavy packs, trudging behind their father through rough terrain. The footage shocked the country. It wasn't just that Phillips had been sighted. It was the nature of the sighting, armed, mobile, and clearly still in control. The children, now older, walked with purpose, their bodies used to the load, as if this way of life had become normal. For many, it was the first real confirmation of what life might have been like in hiding. This wasn't a temporary camping trip, this was survival as a way of life. Experts weighed in. Survivalists and bushmen described how Phillips could have sustained himself and the children for years.
How hard is it to survive in winter in the New Zealand bush?
I don't think hard is the word. Wet might be the word. I mean, if you've got a good shelter established, which I assume that that family has, then you'll be fine.
Hunting deer, pigs and goats, setting snares for rabbits, foraging for edible plants, drawing on local knowledge of caves, huts and remote shelters. But the footage also raised darker questions. How much hardship had the children endured? Had they been sick, hungry or cold through winters in the bush? And what toll was such a life taking on their mental health? It was impossible to know. The video offered proof of existence, but not of well-being. The police seized on the footage as a fresh momentum. Search efforts were redoubled in the dense King Country forests. Helicopters swept valleys, drones combed ridgelines, and patrols worked back roads. Yet once again, Phillips slipped away. The bush was his shield, and every time law enforcement closed in, he vanished into its folds.
I used to have a thermal scope mounted to my gun, and they are better used in an open area because it's a heat detection device, you know. It's not an X-ray machine. My view probably is 50, 60 metres and currently not picking anything up.
The frustration inside police ranks deepened. For every resource deployed, every dollar spent, Phillips remained a step ahead. Some investigators began to suspect that he wasn't doing it alone, that someone was feeding him information, supplies, or shelter. Talk of enablers grew louder in 2024. Locals whispered about sympathisers, people who viewed Phillips as a folk hero, resisting government and media scrutiny. Police publicly stated they believed Phillips had help. Without it, sustaining 3 children for years seemed near impossible. But naming names was another matter. Rural communities are tight-knit, and suspicion without proof only deepened divisions. Neighbours eyed neighbours. Allegations surfaced, but little could be confirmed. The October footage didn't just fuel the manhunt, it fed the myth. For some, it was terrifying. A father with a gun dragging children through wilderness, eluding justice. For others, it was compelling, even romanticised. The outlaw, the bushman, the rugged Kiwi bloke sticking it to the system. Media analysts would later call it the start of Phillips' transformation into a cultural symbol. He wasn't just a fugitive anymore. He was being painted, however inaccurately, as something larger than life. By the close of 2024, Phillips had become a phantom once more. The footage faded from the nightly news, but the questions lingered. Where exactly was he hiding? How was he keeping the children fed and clothed? And how long could this fugitive existence last before something snapped? A mistake, an illness, or a confrontation with police? The answer, no one knew then, was less than a year away. But for the moment, the hunt remained mired in the same shadows where Tom Phillips had chosen to live. By the time the calendar turned 2025, Tom Phillips was no longer just a fugitive. He had become a national obsession, a man at the centre of one of New Zealand's strangest, most unsettling sagas. 4 years had passed since he took his 3 children into hiding. 4 years of sightings, speculation and frustration. And now, as the year unfolded, the case would reach its breaking point. In late August 2025, new CCTV footage emerged. Once again, Phillips was caught on camera, this time near the small coastal town of Piopio. He appeared older, more worn, his beard thicker, his frame leaner. The children were seen with him. For the country, it was proof that the family remained together, alive, and still managing to evade capture. Police renewed their public appeals. They stressed that Phillips was armed and dangerous, that anyone with information should stay away and contact authorities immediately. But the appeals did little to change the reality. He remained free, just out of reach, haunting the fringes of civilization. Then came the early hours of September the 8th, 2025. Police were alerted to a burglary at the PGG Wrightson store in Piopio, a quiet farming town south of Marokopa. The store had been broken into, supplies stolen, fuel, food, equipment. It was the kind of crime authorities believed Phillips had been relying on to sustain his life in hiding. Patrol cars converged on the back roads. At around 2:30 a.m, they encountered a quad bike with 2 riders. Police laid road spikes on Tianga Road to stop the vehicle. What followed would end the 4-year manhunt in the most violent way possible. Accounts remain tightly controlled under ongoing investigations, but the broad strokes are clear.
Tom Phillips' quad bike was stopped with spikes on a rural road in the middle of the night. As a police officer got out of their car, Phillips fired multiple shots at close range, hitting him in the head and shoulder.
When the quad bike hit the spikes, Phillips was forced to stop. Armed police approached. Shots rang out in the dark. A constable was critically injured. Police returned fire. Tom Phillips was killed. For years, he had been a shadow, unseen, unheard, untouchable. In a sudden eruption of violence, his life ended on a rural roadside, in the very landscape he had used as his shield. The 3 children were split between the chaos. One was found at the scene, taken into custody immediately. The other 2 were tracked down later that same day, discovered at a remote campsite, hidden in dense bushland, about 2 kilometers away. There, police recovered firearms and supplies, remnants of a life lived off-grid. The Phillips children, who had spent nearly half their lives in hiding, were now wards of the state, placed in the care of oranga tamariki. In the aftermath, the public expected clarity, details, explanations, answers, but instead they ran into a wall. A High Court injunction. Issued just days after Phillips' death, the injunction restricted what could be reported about the case, particularly details involving the children, their welfare, and certain circumstances of the manhunt. To news organisations, it was a legal muzzle. To the public, it was gasoline on the fire of speculation. What wasn't being said? What did the courts not want them to know? In a vacuum of information, rumours spread faster than facts. Online theories bloomed. Some were simple, claims about where Phillips had been hiding or who had helped him. Others were darker, sprawling conspiracies that tied the case to politics, to media figures, even to secret government agendas. One rumour linked Phillips' case to the former Prime Minister's partner, Clark Gayford, an entirely baseless and false connection that nonetheless spread so widely the courts had to step in. Media outlets found themselves under pressure not only to report responsibly, but to push back against the tide of misinformation. The effect was corrosive. Communities split between those who trusted the official narrative and those who believed the real story was being buried. The Phillips case became not just about a missing father and 3 children, but about the way information itself could be manipulated, suppressed, and mythologized in modern New Zealand. The parallel to the rumours was a strange cultural phenomenon, the mythologizing of Tom Phillips. For some, he became the archetype of the rugged Kiwi bushman, resourceful, defiant, living beyond the reach of the state. The October 2024 footage of him striding through the bush with the rifle and children became iconic in some circles, a symbol of self-reliance and rebellion. For others, he was a dangerous criminal, a man who deprived his children of a normal upbringing, dragged them into hardship, and escalated his crimes until his story ended in blood. The tension between these narratives played out in pubs, online forums, and media columns. Was he a folk hero or a selfish outlaw, a devoted father or a reckless fugitive? The truth, perhaps, was none of these neat categories, but the myth was too powerful to ignore. Journalists found themselves in uncharted territory. How do you report a story that is half fact, half rumour, with a legal injunction hanging overhead? How do you cover children who are victims, witnesses, and central figures without exposing them to more harm? Some outlets erred on the side of caution, reporting only what was confirmed by police or courts. Others flirted with the edges of speculation, knowing that public appetite for detail was insatiable. Social media, unsurprisingly, ran unchecked, amplifying the loudest voices, regardless of the truth. In many ways, the Phillips case became less about one man and more about how New Zealand processes crime, trauma, and secrecy in the age of instant communication. When the dust settled, one thing was undeniable. The saga of Tom Phillips was over. A man who had evaded the state for nearly 4 years had finally been stopped, not by surrender or negotiation, but by bullets in the dark. For his children, the future was uncertain. They faced reintegration into a society that had barely known their formative years, shaped by isolation and survivalism. For the police, the case left scars. One police officer gravely injured, a community shaken, and questions about how the hunt had stretched on for so long. And for the country, this story became a mirror. It reflected back our appetite for myth, our susceptibility to rumour, and our discomfort with the limits of the truth when the courts draw a line. The saga had reached its climax, but the fallout was only beginning. In the hours after Tom Phillips was killed on that rural roadside, police shifted their focus to what mattered most: the 3 children who he had hidden away for nearly 4 years. 2 were still missing, somewhere in the dense Waikato bush. It didn't take long before officers closed in. Deep in a thicket of forest about 2 kilometres from where Phillips was gunned down, police discovered a makeshift campsite. Tents stitched together from tarpaulins, rough shelters pieced from timber and corrugated iron, fire pits blackened with years of use, a scattering of clothes, tools, and scavenged goods. And there, the 2 children, alive. Nearby officers recovered multiple firearms, ammunition, and survival gear. The site bore the hallmarks of a long-term hideout, a place where life had been lived in secret, day after day, season after season. To outsiders, the scene was jarring. For the children, it was home. By the time they were found, the Phillips children had spent almost half their lives off-grid. Their earliest memories were tied to the ordinary world: schools, playgrounds, relatives. But their formative years unfolded under canvas and bush canopy, in a life dictated by survival. Hunting and gathering weren't hobbies, they were necessities. Walking long distances with heavy packs wasn't an adventure, it was routine. Every cough, every scrape, every cold winter night without electricity shaped their reality. The world they returned to in September 2025 was a world they barely remembered. Experts were quick to weigh in. Psychologists, social workers, and child advocates pointed out the immense trauma likely carried by the children. Living in constant isolation, witnessing crime, seeing their father shot dead, these were scars that would not fade easily. Reintegration would be fraught. The children faced not only the challenge of adjusting to modern life, schools, friends, technology, but also the weight of being known by name and by face as part of one of New Zealand's most notorious cases. Protecting their privacy became paramount. Hence the High Court injunction, an effort to shield them from the invasive glare of media and speculation.
A custody issue, end quote. Now, it is important to note here that the family court matters involving children cannot be reported on. Once something is in family court, it is suppressed, and there is a lot in this case that can't be talked about. And here is the kid's mum, Catherine. Now, her kids are now 4 years older than when she last saw them.
Within hours of their recovery, the children were placed under the care of Oranga Tamariki, New Zealand's child welfare agency. For some, this raised bitter irony that Phillips had spent years evading the state only for his children to end up in its custody anyway. But in reality, there was no alternative. They needed safety, structure, and a chance to rebuild lives disrupted by their father's choices. For the agency, it was a monumental task, balancing the children's need for healing with the intense public scrutiny that will follow them for years. For the wider public, details about the children dried up quickly. The injunction meant that little could be reported about their whereabouts, their well-being, or their next steps. But in many ways, that silence was necessary. What mattered was not feeding a public appetite for drama, but allowing 3 young people a chance at something resembling a normal childhood. Still, the imagery of the bush camp lingered in the national imagination. It was more than a campsite. It was a symbol of a man's defiance, of a state's frustration, of children caught in the middle of a life they never chose. Photographs released by police showed bleakness, makeshift beds, tattered belongings, weapons stacked beside tents. It wasn't the romantic bush retreat some had imagined. It was survival, and survival alone. And when the camp was finally dismantled, it marked the end of an era, 4 years of life hidden in the folds of New Zealand's wilderness, reduced to evidence, bags, and ash. The discovery of the camp answered one question: how Phillips and his children had lived for so long. But it raised countless others. Who had helped sustain them? How often had they come close to being discovered? And why did it take so long for the state to bring them home?
The pictures you can see right now, those white containers in the bush, this is a second site that we came across. And Herald photographer Dean Purcell, we were going nearby where the shooting was, and he said, look down there, and bang, there's these 3 white structures in the bush. And this is really interesting. Inside those containers, when you zoom in on the photos, you can see what appears to be cords, electrical cables, large white ducting that is going from inside that white container outside and up into the bush. There also appeared to be a generator inside those containers. So it was essentially 2 very interesting scenes that we filmed yesterday. Now, the second scene that I just spoke about with the white containers, we do not know if that is linked to the Phillips investigation or any ongoing investigations, but certainly it was very close by, just at the top of Apple Tree Road, which is a key entry point into bushland. It's a forestry track. It's very nearby where Phillips was shot dead.
For the children, though, those questions belong to journalists, adults, and investigators. Their reality was simpler and harsher. They had lived in the shadows. And now, dragged back into the light, they faced a lifetime of untangling what those shadows meant. In the weeks after September the 8th, when the gunfire on a dark King Country road brought Tom Phillips' life to an end, the narrative split. On one side, the official account: a wanted man, a father who abducted his children, dragged them into hardship, and armed himself against the state. On the other, something far murkier: a myth, a legend in the making. The folk hero. It is a familiar pattern in human history. Outlaws, renegades, and fugitives often inspire a strange fascination. Ned Kelly in Australia, Jesse James in the United States. Men who lived outside the law, whose defiance against authority became romanticized. For some, Phillips slotted neatly into that lineage. The rugged Kiwi bushman, the self-reliant father who managed to survive with 3 children in the unforgiving back blocks of New Zealand. His ability to evade police for years, his sightings on quad bikes, or caught on grainy footage fed an image of cunning resilience. Social media amplified it. Memes, whispers, and online groups painted him as a good bloke standing against a broken system. His story was woven into a narrative of resistance, of rural men betrayed by the state, of families failed by bureaucracy. But the myth left out the children, the ones carrying packs in October 2024 footage, trudging behind their rifle-bearing father, the ones who spent winters in bush camps, who saw their childhoods replaced with survival drills. For others, there was nothing noble in Phillips' actions. He was not a bushman resisting authority, he was a criminal. They pointed to the Tikawiti bank robbery charges, to the stolen supplies, the armed presence, the police officer shot on the night of his death, to the fact that he denied his children schooling, healthcare, and stability. To them, the narrative was simple. Phillips chose defiance over responsibility. He chose to live life as an outlaw, and he forced his children into that life. The fact that he survived so long was not a mark of heroism, but of failure. A failure of the state to protect its most vulnerable. The grey zone. Between those extremes lay the truth. Complicated, messy, and resistant to tidy labels. Phillips was not Ned Kelly, nor was he a one-dimensional villain. He was a man who made choices, some born of conviction, others of desperation. His upbringing, his values, his grievances with the family court system all played a role. But so did his skill in the bush, his ability to hunt, hide, and improvise. The myth-making stripped away those nuances. It turned a man into a symbol, either of resistance or of recklessness, depending on the eye of the beholder. Part of the mythologizing came from how New Zealand sees itself. The good Kiwi bloke stereotype runs deep. The strong, quiet man of the land, self-sufficient, good with his hands, unbothered by city politics. Commentators noted how quickly this image was projected onto Phillips. His time in the bush, his survival skills, his rugged defiance, all of it fed into the national archetype. Even when the reality was darker, the cultural lens softened it. But behind the romantic sheen was the hard truth. Phillips' actions had real victims, his children, the police constable, who nearly lost his life.
He was a very motivated offender. He had a very high-powered rifle. As you've heard the minister say, and there is absolutely no doubt his intent was to kill the police officer.
The officer suffered an eye injury and underwent surgery yesterday at Waikato Hospital.
What the minister and I saw this morning was very confronting, and he has a long way to go before he gets that opportunity again. His eyes are not open, but he knows we're there. He was able to share a couple of laughs, and that's good.
We spent time with his wife and his family, his father, his mother, sister and brother-in-law, and you can all only imagine how they're feeling.
He is no hero. No one who does this to children, no one who unleashes high-powered rifles on my staff is a hero. Simple as that.
The communities who lived under the shadow of a fugitive, armed and at large, rumours, injunctions, and fuel for the fire. The High Court injunction only strengthened the myth. By restricting what could be said, it created a vacuum, and where information is scarce, speculation thrives. People filled in the blanks with their own narratives. Some claimed Phillips was a martyr, others painted him as a monster. The lack of confirmed detail meant the public could project whatever story they wanted onto him. In that way, Phillips became less of a man and more of a canvas, a mirror reflecting fears, hopes, and frustrations about the state of New Zealand society. What remains then is a dual legacy. On one hand, the myth of the bushman father, the outlaw who outsmarted the state for nearly 4 years living off the land with 3 children by his side. On the other, the cold facts of a case that ended with gunfire, injuries, and 3 children traumatized. The danger of mythologizing is that it distorts accountability. By painting Phillips as either hero or villain, the nuance disappears. What's left is a story that entertains but doesn't explain. And yet myths are powerful. They persist long after the details fade. In years to come, when people speak of Marokopa, they may not remember the injunctions, the court documents, or the police press conferences. They will remember the image. Tom Phillips, rifle on his back, children in tow, vanishing into the bush. That image, guarantee, will live on, whether as a cautionary tale, a folk legend, or a reminder of how thin the line is between man and myth. The gunfire that ended Tom Phillips' life on September the 8th did not end the questions. In many ways, it only multiplied them. When a case consumes a nation for 4 years, the fallout, it isn't neat. It spills across police forces, courtrooms, media, and living rooms. Everyone wants to know, how did this happen? Who bears the responsibility? For the New Zealand police, the case will linger like an open wound. 4 years of searches, sightings, and appeals, yet Phillips slipped through their fingers until it was too late. Critics ask why it took so long to find him and how he managed to sustain his life in the bush with 3 children in tow and whether missteps allowed him to remain free. The most painful moment, of course, is the shooting of a constable critically injured during the Pio confrontation. That officer's recovery is a story in on itself, one of survival, resilience, and trauma. For police, it underscored the dangers of the manhunt, that Phillips wasn't just a missing father, but an armed fugitive, willing to pull the trigger. Inquiries are inevitable. The Independent Police Conduct Authority, IPCA, will examine the events of September the 8th, not only of the shooting, but of the tactics and decisions that led up to it. Did police act appropriately in trying to stop Phillips? Was deadly force justified? These are questions that must be answered in the cold light of review. Overlaying all of this is the High Court injunction, a legal shield intended to protect the children and the integrity of the justice system. It prevents publication of key details, ensuring that their welfare comes before public appetite for information. But injunctions don't erase curiosity. They create tension between what the law deems necessary to protect and what the public demands to know. That tension will hang over the Phillips case for years, a reminder that justice and transparency do not always walk hand in hand. More than anyone else, the children remain at the heart of this saga. They were the silent passengers in a story that turned their father into both myth and outlaw. They endured years of hardship and in the end watched their father die in a violent clash with police. For them, the questions are more personal. How do you rebuild a life after such an upbringing? How do you reconcile the love of a father with the trauma of his choices? And how do you enter a world that has only known you as a headline? Their journey is only beginning. It will involve psychologists, social workers, schools, and above all, time. And it will involve silence, because if there is any justice left to give them, it is the chance to live without their lives being dissected in public. For the public, the Phillips case became more than a crime story. It was a mirror. It reflected back anxieties about family breakdown, mistrust of institutions, and the fragility of social order. It showed how quickly a figure can be mythologized, how easily rumors can eclipse facts, and how thin the line is between empathy and complicity. In pubs, workplaces, and online forums, the debates continue. Was Phillips a victim of a flawed system or a man who chose his own path, regardless of the cost? Was he protecting his children or harming them? Was he resisting oppression or simply breaking the law? There are no tidy answers, only perspectives shaped by belief, experience, and bias. What then is the legacy of Tom Phillips? It is a story of vanishings and survival, of a father who defied the state and raised his children in the bush for 4 years. It is a story of police stretched to their limits, of injunctions and rumors, of a community caught in the crossfire of speculation and secrecy. It is a story that ended in tragedy, one man's death, an officer fighting for his life, 3 children left to rebuild in a world they barely knew. But more than that, it is a story about us, about how we tell stories, how we create myths, how we crave explanations when none are satisfying. Phillips' tale will sit in the same uneasy category as other infamous New Zealand cases, debated, dissected, remembered. It will inspire documentaries, books, maybe even films. It will live in the folklore of Marokopa and the King Country. And in every retelling, the line between fact and myth will blur just a little bit more. In the end, Tom Phillips was not a monster nor a martyr. He was a man, flawed, complex, and human. A man who made choices that cost him his life and shaped the futures of his children. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of all, that behind every headline, every myth, every rumor lies a person with contradictions, motives, and weaknesses. Strip away the noise, and that's what remains. The saga of Tom Phillips is over, but the shadows it cast will linger for years. This has been the Tom Phillips Saga. I've been Shadow Matter, and you've been awesome. Like, subscribe, and push that bell icon like you're waiting for the green man at a pedestrian crossing. And I'll see you here next time in the shadows.